Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a figure few dare to name, a man whispered about in royal courts and confessional booths, rumoured to command more power than the Pope himself. They call him the Black Pope. For centuries, his presence has been hidden in plain sight, cloaked not in white robes, but in black, moving silently through the veins of empires, schools, and palaces. He does not need armies. He does not need thrones. His authority flows through obedience, education, and secrets shared behind closed doors. The Vatican may shine as the visible centre of faith, but in the shadows another leader has shaped kings, steered nations, and even bent history. Some call it myth, others call it conspiracy, but the title of Black Pope has survived because the influence it names refuses to disappear. So before you dismiss this as just another story, ask yourself, what if the most powerful man in the church is not the one you see standing in street, Peter's Square, but the one working in silence just beyond the light? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the world of the Black Pope, and what you learn may change how you see power itself. Imagine a man dressed not in white robes that shine in the sunlight of St. Peter's Square, but in black, moving through halls where few are allowed to walk. He has no crown, no throne, and no cheering crowds. Yet whispers say his reach stretches further than the Pope himself. They call him the Black Pope, a name that sounds like a shadow standing behind the light, hidden but powerful, feared and revered all at once. For centuries, rumours have swirled that this figure holds the keys not only to faith, but to secrets that shape kings, nations, and even the timeline of history itself. Some say his decisions have touched wars, shaped alliances, and guided the direction of the world from behind closed doors. But who is he, and why does his presence remain cloaked in silence? The name Black Pope does not appear in official titles, nor is it found in church announcements. Instead, it was born in whispers among critics, conspirators, and observers who believed there was more to the story than the world was told. Behind the white-robed Pope who blesses the crowds lies another leader, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, a man who commands the Jesuits. To some, this role was simply that of a priest guiding a religious order. To others, it was the position of the most dangerous strategist on earth. His robe was black, his power immense, and his influence invisible. That is why people gave him a name that sounded like both a warning and a secret. Throughout history, every great seat of power casts shadows. The throne of Caesar, the crown of a king, the papal tiara, all have faced rivals not from outside, but from those who stand just behind the curtain. The Black Pope became one of those shadows, his image shaped as much by suspicion as by reality. Those who opposed the Jesuits claimed that this hidden general controlled kings by whispering in their ears, that he decided which empires rose and which fell, and that no pope could truly move without his influence pressing from the dark. The truth is harder to pin down, but the legend remains. Imagine Europe in the year 1540, when the Society of Jesus was born. It was a time of chaos, war, and reformation. The church was losing its grip, monarchs were rising, and people hungered for answers. Into this world stepped a group of men bound by strict vows of loyalty and secrecy, led by one general who would command them like an army. This structure alone made many nervous. It looked more like a chain of command than a religious family, and at its head stood a single man whose orders could ripple across continents. No wonder people began to wonder if his hand rested not just on scripture, but on the levers of history itself. The image of the Black Pope has grown across centuries, not because of what he said in public, but because of what was never said. Silence, secrecy, and strategy built a myth that has lasted until today. And that is where our story begins, in the shadows behind the golden light of the Vatican, where a man in black has been called the most powerful leader you were never meant to see. The title Black Pope was never official, never printed in church documents or carved into stone above a doorway. It was born from whispers, carried from pamphlets, gossip, and suspicion, until it became one of the most chilling nicknames in history. To understand it, we must step back into the 16th century, when the world was being ripped apart by reformations, revolutions, and wars of faith. At that time, the Catholic Church was struggling to keep its grip on power. The Protestant Reformation had shaken its authority. Kings were no longer so willing to bow before Rome, and entire nations were beginning to choose their own paths. Out of this storm rose the Society of Jesus, a new order founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. Unlike other religious groups, the Jesuits were not cloistered monks who stayed behind monastery walls. They were soldiers of faith, bound by strict obedience, trained in discipline, and educated to lead. At their head stood a single man known as the Superior General. He was not a bishop or a cardinal, yet his authority within the order was absolute. What made him unique was that every Jesuit swore to obey him, as though he were the voice of God on earth. This was not a democracy, it was a command structure, and it looked more like a military than a monastery. Critics began to mutter that this Superior General held more real influence than the Pope himself, because while the Pope's power was ceremonial and visible, the General's was hidden, direct, and unquestioned. His robe was black, his command absolute, and soon people began to call him the Black Pope. The phrase carried more than one meaning. On the surface, it described the black cassock worn by the Jesuits, in contrast to the white robes of the Pope in Rome. But beneath the surface, it implied something darker. It suggested a rival papacy, a shadow throne, and a hidden ruler who pulled strings from behind the Vatican walls. In the 17th and 18th centuries, enemies of the Jesuits spread pamphlets and books that accused the Black Pope of being the true master of the Catholic world. They wrote that kings trembled before him, that monarchs sought his blessing in secret, and that even the Pope could not escape his influence. Some of these accusations were propaganda, meant to smear the order. But like all powerful rumours, they stuck, feeding into a legend that has survived into modern times. Even today, when most people hear the phrase Black Pope, they are not thinking about a priest sitting quietly in Rome. They imagine a figure cloaked in mystery, perhaps a mastermind in the shadows, someone whose decisions ripple across continents. Whether the name was born in truth or in slander, it has carried the same weight for centuries. A warning, a suspicion, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful ruler is not the one seen in the light, but the one who stands just beyond it, commanding with silence. The story of the Society of Jesus begins not with a pope or a king, but with a soldier lying wounded on the battlefield in the year 1521. His name was Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish nobleman whose leg had been shattered by a cannonball. During his long recovery, he turned to books, but instead of tales of knights and battles, he found himself reading the lives of saints and the scriptures. What began as boredom slowly turned into a spark of faith that consumed him. He gave up his old life of weapons and courtly ambition and set out on a pilgrimage to serve God in a way that was not bound by the walls of a monastery. From this single man's transformation grew one of the most disciplined and influential orders the Catholic Church would ever know. Ignatius gathered a small group of followers, students, and friends who, like him, were searching for something deeper than the ordinary path of priesthood. In the year 1534, they formed a brotherhood bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they added something new, a fourth vow that set them apart from all others, complete and unquestioning obedience to the Pope. At first glance, this may have seemed like ultimate loyalty, but in practice, it gave the group a flexibility that made them unlike any other. They were free to move wherever the Pope directed them, missionaries, scholars, and preachers who could be sent across the world with a single command. It was a spiritual army without borders. What made this brotherhood even more unique was the structure that Ignatius designed for it. The order was built like a chain of command. At the very top stood the Superior General, a man chosen for life, whose orders every Jesuit was bound to follow. Beneath him lay a carefully organized hierarchy of provincials, rectors, and superiors who oversaw schools, missions, and communities. Communication was constant. Letters flowed back to Rome from every corner of the globe, creating a web of information and control that rivaled any royal government of the time. To outsiders, this discipline looked suspicious. The Jesuits seemed too well organized, too united, too ready to obey. Critics claimed it was impossible that such a structure could exist without hidden ambitions. Supporters saw in them the perfect instrument of reform, a brotherhood dedicated to spreading education, defending the church, and serving wherever they were most needed. Both views carried a grain of truth. The Jesuits were men of prayer, but also men of action. They entered universities, advised rulers, travelled to the farthest continents, and stood at the heart of political and spiritual battles. Their unity and loyalty made them efficient, and efficiency is often mistaken for control. What began as a wounded soldier's vision soon became a brotherhood that seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere. The foundations they laid in the 16th century would one day give birth to the image of a hidden general, the Black Pope, who commanded not armies of steel, but armies of minds. The path to becoming a Jesuit was never easy, and it was never meant to be. From the very beginning, the Society of Jesus demanded a level of commitment and discipline that set it apart from every other religious order of its time. Those who entered were not only pledging their lives to faith, they were giving themselves entirely to an organization that functioned more like a military command than a community of monks. The first stage of training often took years. A young man would study, pray, and work in silence, testing his resolve against the weight of obedience. Unlike other orders that emphasized solitude or personal devotion, the Jesuits drilled their members in loyalty to the group, and above all to their leader, the Superior General. This was the man whose word would override all others. If he commanded, they obeyed, not after debate or hesitation, but immediately, as if the command had come from heaven itself. This obedience became legendary, both admired and feared. The oath taken by a Jesuit was not light. Beyond the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience shared by other religious orders, there was the distinct promise of total submission. In some accounts, critics described this obedience in stark language, saying that a Jesuit was expected to be like a corpse in the hands of his superior, lifeless, moving only when commanded. The language was shocking, but it captured the depth of surrender expected within the order. Such imagery helped fuel the mystique that surrounded them, a mystique that gave rise to suspicions of hidden power. Within the formation process, Jesuits underwent the spiritual exercises crafted by Ignatius of Loyola, a series of meditations and reflections designed to sharpen both the soul and the mind. These exercises pushed recruits to strip away personal desires and to learn to discern the will of God through their superiors. It was both spiritual training and psychological shaping, a way of forging men who could be trusted to carry out missions without question. This structure created a chain of command that was unlike anything else in the church. Orders flowed downward with precision, while reports and information flowed upward in constant streams. Letters travelled from distant missions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas back to Rome, where the Superior General would read, evaluate, and direct the next moves. The Jesuits became known not only for their loyalty, but for their efficiency, a network that seemed to function with the smoothness of a hidden empire. To the outside world, this oath and order looked both inspiring and terrifying. Admirers saw a disciplined army of faith, ready to serve God anywhere in the world. Critics saw an organization too united, too secretive, and too powerful to be trusted. In this tension, the legend of the Black Pope grew stronger, for if one man could command such obedience from thousands across the globe, then perhaps he was more than just a leader of an order. Perhaps he was a shadow ruler whose quiet commands echoed louder than the voice of the Pope himself. Power does not always march with armies or roar with cannons. Sometimes it whispers in classrooms, bends ears in confessionals, or shapes hearts in quiet missions. This was the invisible architecture the Jesuits built, a network of influence so subtle that it often went unnoticed, yet so strong that it reached from Europe to the farthest edges of the known world. At the heart of this design were schools. From the 16th century onward, the Jesuits founded colleges across Europe, teaching not just theology, but philosophy, science, languages, and the classics. Kings and nobles sent their sons to these institutions, knowing that the Jesuits offered some of the best education of the age. Students who passed through their halls carried Jesuit thought into governments, courts, and armies. This was not brute force. It was soft power, shaping the future leaders of nations before they even wore crowns. Missions were the next pillar of this hidden structure. Jesuits sailed to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, adapting to cultures with skill that stunned even their rivals. In China, they learned the language, wore the robes of scholars, and presented themselves as friends of knowledge. In South America, they built communities where European and native traditions blended under their guidance. Wherever they went, they did not simply preach, they observed, reported, and planted roots of influence that reached back to Rome. The confessional was another instrument, quieter but perhaps even more powerful. In the private act of confession, rulers unburdened their souls to Jesuit priests. In that sacred space, secrets were spoken, fears confessed, and sins revealed. Though bound to secrecy, Jesuits emerged with an understanding of the minds and weaknesses of those who held crowns and swords. Knowledge is power, and no library of intelligence was greater than the collective memories of thousands of priests who listened in silence across continents. Courts, too, felt their touch. Jesuits often served as advisors, confessors, or tutors to kings, queens, and ministers. Their advice was wrapped in the language of faith, but the effect was deeply political. To some rulers they became indispensable, men who could guide not only the soul but the fate of an empire. To critics it looked like manipulation, an invisible hand steering monarchs from behind velvet curtains. By weaving these threads together, the Jesuits built a network that required no armies to enforce it. Schools trained minds, missions spread influence, confessionals revealed secrets, and courts offered access to power. Each strand alone seemed harmless, but together they formed a web that stretched across continents and through centuries. Outsiders often struggled to see where spiritual devotion ended and political strategy began. To their supporters, the Jesuits were defenders of faith and builders of knowledge. To their enemies, they were spies, plotters, and agents of a hidden general. It was within this invisible architecture that the legend of the Black Pope found its strongest foundation, for only a shadow ruler could command a network so vast, yet remain almost unseen. Throughout history, rulers have always sought wise voices to guide their choices. Kings needed counsel not only on matters of war and taxes, but on the unseen burdens of conscience and faith. Into this role stepped the Jesuits, men trained not just in scripture, but in philosophy, politics, and the art of persuasion. Their presence in royal courts was never loud or dramatic, but their proximity to power gave birth to suspicions that echoed across centuries. One of the earliest examples can be found in the court of France during the 16th century. Jesuit confessors became close to the monarchy, guiding kings in both spiritual matters and political strategies. In times of religious conflict, when the wars of faith tore the country apart, these priests stood at the side of rulers, whispering advice in moments that could determine the future of nations. Critics claimed that the crown was no longer guided by reason or diplomacy, but by the influence of Jesuit voices. The same patterns appeared in Spain, Portugal, and Austria, where Jesuits advised emperors and kings. They taught royal children, confessed reigning monarchs, and sometimes even drafted speeches or policies in the name of faith. To their supporters, this was a sign of devotion, the church standing close to rulers to ensure justice and morality. But to their enemies, it looked like control, a hidden hand steering thrones without ever needing to wear a crown. The power of council was not limited to Europe. In the 17th century, Jesuits travelled as far as China, where Matteo Ricci entered the imperial court. He impressed the Ming rulers with his mastery of astronomy, mathematics, and language. Soon, he and his fellow Jesuits became trusted advisors on matters that went far beyond religion. They were asked to design calendars, advise on rituals, and even contribute to imperial policy. This closeness to an emperor thousands of miles from Rome only deepened the suspicion that the Jesuits were more than missionaries. They were diplomats, scientists, and strategists, operating under the command of a single general. The image of the Jesuit advisor as both confessor and counselor created a tension that never faded. On one side stood those who believed the Jesuits brought learning, discipline, and moral guidance to rulers in need. On the other stood those who saw manipulation, a quiet shaping of decisions that belonged to kings alone. It was this tension that gave the idea of the Black Pope its sharp edge. If one superior general could direct the actions of men who advised monarchs across the world, then his influence extended far beyond the pulpit. It touched battles, treaties, and dynasties. In the halls of power, where decisions were made that shaped empires, the Jesuits were often present, silent but strategic, and their presence left a shadow. The suspicion grew not from what they openly declared, but from what they might have whispered behind closed doors, words that could turn the fate of nations. When Ignatius of Loyola founded the Society of Jesus in the year 1540, he could not have imagined how the role of superior general would evolve into one of the most feared and respected positions in the Catholic world. Ignatius himself became the first to hold the title. Unlike other leaders of religious orders, he was not content to simply guide his men in prayer and ritual. He saw the Jesuits as an army of God, disciplined, loyal, and mobile. From his modest room in Rome, he directed missionaries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas through a constant stream of letters. His hand was steady, his command absolute, and his example set the tone for every superior general that followed. Ignatius was succeeded by Diego Lainez, a Spaniard who carried the mantle after the death of the founder in 1556. Lainez was present at the Council of Trent, a gathering that would reshape Catholic doctrine in response to the Protestant Reformation. His speeches were sharp and persuasive, showing that the Jesuits were not just quiet scholars, but active players in the most critical debates of the age. Under his leadership, the order expanded further, gaining trust from popes who relied on Jesuits as defenders of the faith in an era of crisis. The third superior general, Francis Borgia, brought an even more striking example of the power tied to the role. Borgia was no ordinary priest. He had once been a duke, a man of noble blood, tied to one of the most influential families in Spain. His decision to give up wealth and title to serve the Jesuits stunned Europe. When he became superior general in 1565, he gave the order not only spiritual depth, but also aristocratic connections. Under Borgia, the Jesuits grew in prestige and secured influence at royal courts, strengthening their image as men who could move with ease between palaces and missions. As the years passed, each superior general added another layer to the authority of the office. Claudius Aquaviva, who served from 1581 to 1615, perfected the system of internal control. He oversaw the drafting of the Jesuit constitutions, a document that cemented the rules of obedience and discipline. Aquaviva expanded the network of schools and colleges, turning education into a cornerstone of Jesuit identity. His long term of leadership proved that the superior general was not a temporary guide, but a commander for life. a man whose decisions could shape the order for decades. By the 17th century, the figure of the Superior General had become both admired and feared. His authority stretched across oceans, carried by letters and trusted envoys. His voice could decide the fate of missions in China, colleges in France, or conversions in South America. For outsiders, this level of control seemed almost impossible. For insiders, it was simply the natural design of the order. From Ignatius onward, the role of the Superior General emerged as a position unlike any other in the Church. A throne without a crown, a power without a title, and the living seed of the myth that would one day be called the Black Pope. Long before governments built spy agencies or nations created secret services, the Jesuits had already mastered the art of gathering and managing information. Their weapon was not the sword but the pen, and their battlefield was the endless flow of ink and parchment. From the 16th century onward, every Jesuit missionary, teacher, and priest was required to write detailed reports to Rome. These were not casual letters, but carefully structured accounts describing local politics, culture, language, and even the private moods of kings and nobles. Over time, the headquarters of the Society of Jesus became a vast clearinghouse of information, perhaps the first true global intelligence network in history. Imagine a Jesuit in Japan during the year 1580, describing the customs of the shogun and the conflicts among warlords. At the same time, another Jesuit in Brazil was writing about the tribes of the Amazon and the movements of Portuguese settlers. Meanwhile, in Europe, Jesuits in royal courts reported on the health of monarchs, the rivalries of ministers, and the whispers of rebellion. All of these letters travelled back to Rome, where the Superior General and his advisors read them, analysed them, and issued orders in return. It was a system so organised and far-reaching that many monarchs could not match its scope. What made this practice so effective was not just the content, but the discipline. Jesuits were trained to observe carefully, to note details others ignored, and to present facts with precision. They described landscapes, trade routes, and even astronomical observations with scientific accuracy. But mixed into these reports were insights about politics, alliances, and personal weaknesses of local leaders. This blending of scholarship and strategy made Jesuit letters treasures of knowledge and sources of suspicion. To supporters, they were proof of dedication, a global network united by faith and scholarship. To enemies, they looked like the eyes and ears of a hidden empire. Critics began to whisper that no ruler was safe from Jesuit observation, that every court had its confessor, every city its school, and every corner of the world its report waiting to be carried to Rome. Whether these fears were exaggerated or not, they reveal the power of perception. Information, once gathered and centralized, becomes influence. A monarch who sought Jesuit advice might never realize that his decisions were already being studied and recorded thousands of miles away. By the 17th century, the sheer volume of letters was staggering. The archives of the Society of Jesus filled with millions of pages covering every continent and subject. Even today, historians are astonished by the detail of these reports, describing everything from Chinese astronomy to the diets of African tribes. The Jesuits had built a machine that turned ink and parchment into policy, shaping strategies not only for missions but for nations. It was this unseen power that gave strength to the legend of the Black Pope, for only a leader with global vision could command an army of information long before the world had a word for intelligence. In the quiet of a church, far from the noise of courts and battlefields, there exists a place where even the most powerful kneel. The confessional, a small wooden booth with a screen of shadows, became one of the most important corridors of influence in history. Here, kings and queens, generals and ministers laid bare their souls, confessing sins they would never admit in public. For the Jesuits, who often served as confessors, this was not a place for judgment, but for guidance. Yet, with every whispered word, they gained insight into the minds of rulers and the fragile balance of nations. The act of confession was sacred, bound by secrecy, but the knowledge it granted shaped the way Jesuits understood the world. A monarch might confess guilt over a war, doubt about an alliance, or fear of betrayal. These fears revealed more than strategy ever could. In listening with patience and counsel, Jesuit confessors became trusted advisors, their influence extending beyond the forgiveness of sins. Critics accused them of wielding that trust as leverage. They claimed that Jesuits, through confession, could steer rulers toward decisions that aligned with the interests of the order and its superior general. Whether true or exaggerated, the idea spread, feeding suspicion that the Black Pope ruled not through armies, but through the whispers of guilty kings. One famous example is found in 17th century France, where Jesuit confessors guided monarchs at a time of endless conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The advice given in those booths could mean the difference between war and peace. In Spain, Jesuits served as confessors to royal families for generations, shaping policies of empire while remaining cloaked in the silence of spiritual duty. Even beyond Europe, in the courts of emperors in Asia and noble families in South America, the same pattern appeared. The confessional was not just a ritual, it was a channel of diplomacy. To supporters, this closeness was a blessing. They saw it as evidence that rulers were being guided by men of faith, that conscience and morality influenced decisions of state. To enemies, it looked like manipulation, as if monarchs were puppets and Jesuits the unseen hands that pulled their strings. The truth likely lay somewhere between the two, but perception is often as powerful as fact. What mattered was that rulers trusted their Jesuit confessors deeply, sometimes more than their own ministers or families. In that trust, suspicion thrived. Imagine a general ready to march an army, pausing because of the counsel of a priest. Imagine a treaty delayed or rewritten after a whispered conversation in a booth of shadows. These moments, invisible to history's records, carried weight that could tilt empires. The legend of the Black Pope fed on such stories, for if one superior general commanded the confessors of kings, then his hand touched every corner of power. In the silence of the confessional, diplomacy and faith merged, and the world changed without a single voice being raised in public. When people think of power, they often picture armies or treasures of gold. But the Jesuits understood something more subtle. They saw that the greatest influence rested not in weapons or wealth, but in the shaping of young minds. From the 16th century onward, the Society of Jesus built schools across Europe and far beyond. These were not simple classrooms where children learned to read prayers. They were centers of excellence where philosophy, science, literature, and languages were taught at levels unmatched by most institutions of the time. Soon the sons of nobles and kings filled these schools, sitting side by side with the children of merchants and commoners, all moulded under the same careful instruction. The Jesuits believed that education was a form of service to God, but it was also a tool of influence. A prince who studied under Jesuit teachers carried their way of thinking into the throne room. A minister, trained in their methods, shaped the policies of empires. Even great thinkers and scientists found themselves guided, sometimes challenged, by Jesuit instructors who demanded discipline and clarity of thought. The curriculum was rigorous. Students learned Latin and Greek, not simply as languages, but as gateways to the wisdom of ancient civilizations. They studied rhetoric to sharpen their speech, philosophy to train their reason, and theology to anchor their faith. Mathematics and astronomy were also taught, showing that the Jesuits valued science as much as scripture. This combination of intellectual breadth and spiritual depth produced graduates who could navigate courts, universities, and battlefields with equal confidence. Parents recognized this advantage quickly. By the 17th century, Jesuit schools had become the preferred training grounds for Europe's elite. Monarchs wanted their heirs educated there. Ministers sent their children hoping to secure future influence. Even rivals of the church admitted the quality of Jesuit teaching. The classrooms of the order became silent factories of leadership, producing men who would go on to govern nations, lead armies, and shape ideas that lasted for centuries. Yet with this success came suspicion. Critics whispered that Jesuit schools were less about learning and more about indoctrination. They accused the order of planting seeds of loyalty that would one day bloom into obedience to the Black Pope. Every student who passed through their doors, they claimed, carried a hidden mark of Jesuit influence, even if he did not realize it. Whether this was truth or slander, the results were clear. Jesuit education left a deep imprint on Europe's intellectual and political life. The order had found a way to guide the future, not by force, but by shaping the men who would hold the future in their hands. In the long halls of Jesuit colleges, with their ink-stained desks and echoing prayers, the myth of invisible power gained strength. For if the Superior General commanded the schools, then he commanded the minds of those destined to rule. The Jesuits rose quickly in fame and influence, but with that rise came fear and resentment. By the late 16th century, the order had already planted schools, missions, and advisors across continents. Their discipline and reach made them respected, but to many outside the church it looked like something else. It looked like a hidden empire. Out of this suspicion, a legend began to form, one that would stain their reputation for centuries. It was called the Black Legend. This story was not written in official histories, but in the pamphlets and speeches of their enemies. Rival religious groups, jealous nobles, and even monarchs who felt threatened by the Jesuits all added their voices. They accused the order of being manipulative, of controlling kings through confession, of spying on nations, and of plotting to rule the world in secret. At the center of these accusations was the figure of the Superior General. Because he wore the black robe of the Jesuits, and because his power seemed to stretch across borders, people gave him a name meant to provoke both fear and suspicion. They called him the Black Pope. Pamphlets spread through Europe painting this figure as more dangerous than any king or even the Pope in Rome. They described him as a man who could command thousands with a single word, who placed his followers in every court, and who held secrets no one else could see. These texts often mixed truth with lies, real events with exaggerations, creating an image so powerful that it stuck in the public imagination. For common people who did not fully understand the inner workings of the church, the idea was easy to believe. They saw Jesuits everywhere, teaching their children, advising their rulers, and whispering in confessionals. It felt as if the order was always present, always watching. To them, the thought of a hidden pope in black pulling the strings seemed less like fiction and more like the only explanation. Monarchs who clashed with Jesuits added fuel to the fire. When Jesuits challenged royal power or resisted policies that clashed with their mission, rulers accused them of treachery. Expulsions followed in countries like France, Portugal, and Spain. Each expulsion came with fiery speeches and printed tracts, describing the Jesuits as enemies of the state. These accusations spread across borders faster than the truth could catch up. Even when the Jesuits defended themselves with reasoned arguments, the shadow of the Black Pope loomed larger. The legend was too dramatic, too compelling, and too useful for their enemies to abandon. By the 17th century, the Black Pope was no longer just a nickname whispered in secret. It had become a symbol, repeated in polemics, sermons, and political debates. It stood for suspicion, for fear of hidden power, and for the belief that behind the Pope dressed in white, there was another Pope dressed in black, who truly ruled. Whether it was fact or fiction mattered less than the effect it had. The Black Legend took shape not because it was proven, but because it was believed. And belief, especially when fed by fear, can be more powerful than truth itself. By the 18th century, the Jesuits had become one of the most powerful and controversial orders in the Catholic Church. Their schools shaped elites, their missions spanned continents, and their confessors whispered in the ears of kings. But the very strength that made them admired also made them dangerous in the eyes of rulers. Monarchs in Europe began to see the Jesuits not as allies, but as rivals, a network that could challenge royal authority while claiming loyalty to Rome. What followed was one of the most dramatic suppressions in church history, a wave of expulsions that seemed destined to destroy the order once and for all. In the year 1759, the Kingdom of Portugal moved first. The Marquis of Pombal, a powerful minister, accused the Jesuits of meddling in politics and resisting reforms. He ordered them expelled, their schools closed, and their properties seized. Only a few years later, France followed, pressured by ministers who saw the Jesuits as a threat to royal power. By 1767, Spain and Naples joined in, casting the order out of their lands and scattering thousands of priests across the globe. The final blow came in 1773 when Pope Clement XIV, under immense pressure from European monarchs, issued a decree formally suppressing the Society of Jesus. Overnight, an order that had once been the sharpest weapon of the Church was legally erased. To the outside world, it looked like the end. Yet the Jesuits did not truly disappear. Their strength had never been in crowns or armies, but in their network, a web of loyalty and discipline that no decree could fully cut. In countries where the suppression was not enforced, such as Prussia and Russia, the order quietly survived. Catherine the Great of Russia refused to expel them, recognizing their value as educators. In secret, Jesuits continued their work, teaching, advising, and writing, keeping alive the spirit of the order even while the institution itself was officially dissolved. For 41 years, the Jesuits lived in this strange limbo, banned on paper, but alive in practice. Their resilience was astonishing. Without public recognition or papal support, they maintained contact, preserved their traditions, and waited. In the year 1814, Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus, declaring it once again a legitimate order of the Church. What shocked many was how quickly the Jesuits reassembled. Within years, their schools reopened, their missions restarted, and their advisors returned to courts and colleges. It was as if the suppression had been no more than a pause, a wound that healed with surprising speed. This survival suggested something deeper about the order. It was not just an organization, but a living network of discipline, memory, and loyalty that could withstand even the most brutal blows. For their enemies, this resilience was proof of conspiracy, a sign that the Jesuits were indestructible because they were more than human. For their supporters, it was proof of divine favor. In either case, the legend of the Black Pope only grew stronger. For an institution that cannot be destroyed feels more like a shadow empire than a brotherhood of priests. The Superior General of the Jesuits lived with a paradox that both defined his authority and fueled the suspicions around him. On paper, he was the most loyal servant of the papacy, bound by a vow that set the Jesuits apart from every other order in the Catholic Church. While monks promised poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits promised something more, a fourth vow of complete submission to the Pope. If the Pope commanded them to sail across oceans or enter the court of a hostile king, they obeyed without hesitation. This should have made the Superior General nothing more than an instrument of papal will. Yet history tells a more complicated story. In practice, the Superior General commanded thousands of men spread across every continent. These men answered not directly to the Pope, but to him. Every letter, every report, every instruction flowed through his office in Rome before it reached the wider world. This made the general the hub of a global network, more aware of events in faraway lands than the papacy itself. Popes relied on Jesuit knowledge and their schools, yet some began to fear the very structure they had authorized. To critics, it looked as though the Pope in white held the title, but the Pope in black held the reins. The tension became most visible in moments of crisis. When popes clashed with monarchs, Jesuits were often already at the heart of those courts as confessors or advisors. The Superior General could guide their actions with instructions that were technically in service of the papacy, but sometimes seemed to outpace or even overshadow it. In this way, the Jesuits were accused of operating a second centre of power, one that bent the world toward Rome, but through the hand of the general rather than the Pope himself. The paradox deepened when expulsion came in the 18th century. Monarchs accused the Jesuits of serving not the Pope but their general. Ironically, when Pope Clement XIV suppressed the order in 1773, it was seen less as papal judgment and more as surrender to political pressure. To critics, this proved that the Black Pope's shadow had grown too long. If kings demanded the Jesuits be silenced, then surely they must have been more powerful than the papacy itself. When the order was restored in 1814, the paradox returned. The vow of obedience to the Pope remained intact, yet the structure that concentrated authority in the hands of one man endured. This tension never disappeared. Even in the modern era, when Jesuits held influence in universities, politics, and science, the same suspicion lingered. How could one man, dressed in black and known as the General, command such loyalty across the world while still claiming to serve in perfect obedience? The paradox became the seed of myth. For supporters, it was proof of devotion. For enemies, it was proof of conspiracy. And at the centre of it all stood the Superior General, a man torn between Rome and the world, between obedience and power, between the image of servant and the legend of ruler. In the heart of Rome, there is a modest room that carries a weight out of proportion to its size. It is not adorned with gold like the Vatican halls, nor does it display crowns or jewels. Yet from this room, the Superior General of the Jesuits directs a network that stretches across continents. The walls are simple, lined with shelves of books and files. A desk sits at the centre, often covered with letters that have travelled weeks or months from the farthest corners of the world. This is the command post of a man known to many as the Black Pope. The day begins early. Reports arrive from Jesuit colleges in Europe, missions in Asia, and communities in the Americas. Each letter is more than news. It is a piece of intelligence describing political changes, cultural shifts, and the pulse of nations. The Superior General reads carefully, comparing details, weighing decisions, and noting where intervention may be required. A governor in South America may be pressuring a mission, a royal court in France may be debating new laws, or a school in Germany may be facing opposition. Every matter is considered, and each response is crafted with precision. Audiences follow. Jesuits from different provinces travel to Rome seeking counsel. They enter the general's room quietly, often nervous in the presence of the man who embodies their vows of obedience. He listens to their challenges, asks sharp questions, and issues instructions that may alter the course of their missions. His words are calm but decisive, for he knows that loyalty rests not only on authority, but also on trust. Between audiences, the general meets with his closest advisors, men chosen to assist in the task of managing a global order. Together, they map out strategies, plan responses to threats, and discuss the placement of trusted members into key positions. The rhythm is steady but relentless, a choreography of decisions that must balance spiritual duty with political reality. The afternoon often brings visits from outsiders, ambassadors, and church officials who seek the general's perspective. Though he is bound to obedience to the Pope, many come to him directly, knowing his reach extends into classrooms, confessionals, and courts. Every meeting adds another layer of responsibility, another chance to shape the path of nations quietly from behind a desk. As the evening draws in, the room fills again with papers. Drafted responses are signed and sealed, ready to travel back across seas and mountains. Instructions to missionaries, encouragement to teachers, reminders to confessors, all crafted in a style that blends firmness with faith. By the time the lamps are lit, the Superior General has touched the lives of thousands without leaving his room. To the world outside, this daily routine may look ordinary, but to those who understand the network it represents, it is extraordinary. The general's room is not merely an office. It is the hidden centre of an empire without borders, where the stroke of a pen can echo across continents. It is here, in the quiet discipline of each day, that the legend of the Black Pope takes on flesh. When the Jesuits set sail across the oceans in the 16th and 17th centuries, they carried with them more than the cross and the Bible. They carried knowledge of languages, sciences, and cultures that allowed them to slip into societies in ways few Europeans ever could. Their missions were places of worship and study, but to many observers, they also looked like footholds of strategy, bridges between continents and Rome. In South America, Jesuits established what became known as the reductions, settlements where indigenous communities lived under Jesuit guidance. These were not simple villages. They had schools, workshops, and even orchestras. The people learned music, farming, and crafts while being introduced to Christianity. Outsiders marveled at their organization, but critics claimed they were too perfect, too independent, almost like small republics within larger empires. Rumors spread that the Jesuits were building states of their own, loyal not to the crown but to their superior general. Whether this was true or not, the suspicion stuck. In Asia, the pattern was different but equally striking. In India and China, Jesuits approached missions with cultural fluency. They dressed like scholars, studied local philosophies, and mastered complex languages. Matteo Ricci, in China, astonished the imperial court by not only speaking fluent Mandarin, but also offering maps, clocks, and astronomical calculations more accurate than the Chinese had ever seen. To many he seemed less a missionary and more a diplomat, a man who could move in the highest circles of power. Jesuits became advisors to emperors, introducing Western science while quietly spreading Christian thought. In Japan they adapted again, learning customs and engaging with warlords as equals. Their ability to blend so seamlessly into cultures raised admiration but also suspicion. How could these men move so easily among peoples so different from their own unless they were trained not just as priests but as strategists? For monarchs back in Europe, this flexibility was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Jesuits expanded the reach of Christianity further than any other order. On the other, their loyalty to the superior general, rather than to any particular crown, made them seem like agents of a hidden power. Reports of their missions reached Rome in thick letters filled with details about geography, trade, and politics. Information valuable far beyond the pulpit. This is why some claimed the missions were not only about souls, but also about strategy. The Jesuits themselves insisted they were only serving God and the Pope, but their ability to gather knowledge and establish trust wherever they went made many uneasy. From the jungles of Paraguay to the courts of Beijing, the Jesuits left footprints that were impossible to ignore. They taught, they healed, they converted, but they also built networks of influence that spanned oceans. To their followers, this was proof of divine calling. To their enemies, it was proof of conspiracy. In either case, the mission fields became hidden fronts, places where the legend of the Black Pope reached beyond Rome into the very heart of the world. For the Jesuits, saving souls was not only a matter of prayer, but also of knowledge. They understood that to gain trust in foreign lands or at royal courts, they had to offer something of value beyond sermons. This is why the Society of Jesus became famous not just for its missions, but for its scholarship in astronomy, linguistics, and mathematics. These subjects were more than science. They were tools of influence, a kind of currency that opened doors and built respect. In the late 16th century, Jesuits became some of the leading astronomers in Europe. They studied the stars, not only for navigation, but also for the calendars that guided farming, festivals, and trade. When they carried this knowledge abroad, they astonished rulers. In China, Jesuits presented astronomical tables more precise than those of the imperial scholars. They predicted eclipses with accuracy, something that gave them immense prestige at the emperor's court. To the Chinese, these men in black robes were not just missionaries, but masters of the heavens. By aligning science with faith, Jesuits positioned themselves as trusted advisors. Linguistics was another field where they excelled. Jesuits did not arrive in new lands, expecting others to learn their tongue. Instead, they mastered the languages they encountered. They studied native dialects in South America, recorded Asian scripts, and created dictionaries and grammars that remain valuable even today. This ability to speak directly to people in their own words broke barriers that others could not cross. It also gave Jesuits access to cultures in ways that went far deeper than surface conversation. Through language they earned trust, but they also gathered knowledge, mapping the thoughts and traditions of entire civilizations. Mathematics, too, became a powerful weapon in their intellectual arsenal. Jesuit colleges in Europe trained students in logic, geometry, and arithmetic, and this expertise traveled with missionaries. In India, Jesuits engaged with scholars on mathematical theories, comparing Western and Eastern methods. In Europe, their teachers shaped future leaders by training them in reasoning and problem-solving. Knowledge in numbers, like knowledge of stars, became another way to demonstrate mastery and win influence. Critics claimed this blending of science and faith was not innocent. They argued that Jesuits used knowledge as leverage, offering it to rulers in exchange for access, loyalty, or protection. A king who relied on a Jesuit for accurate navigation or a correct calendar might also be more open to the Jesuits' advice on politics or religion. Whether intentional or not, this exchange of science for trust made the order look less like missionaries and more like strategists. By the 17th century, the reputation of Jesuits as scholars had spread across the globe. Their observatories, libraries, and colleges were admired even by those who distrusted them. To their friends, this was proof that faith and reason could walk hand in hand. To their enemies, it was proof that the Jesuits were weaving knowledge into a net of control. In both views, the result was the same. The Society of Jesus turned the science of souls into the science of power, showing that sometimes a telescope or a grammar book could influence history as much as any crown or sword. The Jesuits were often welcomed into royal courts as confessors, teachers, and advisors, but their closeness to power also brought inevitable conflict. Monarchs, who saw themselves as supreme rulers of their realms, did not always appreciate a religious order that answered to a superior in Rome rather than to the crown. Again and again, through the 17th and 18th centuries, clashes broke out, moments when the Jesuits discovered both the limits of their influence and their uncanny ability to return, even after being cast out. In France, tensions grew as Jesuit confessors guided kings during times of religious war. Their advice to uphold Catholic orthodoxy won them favour with some but suspicion with others. Rivals at court whispered that the Jesuits were pulling strings behind the throne, and resentment built among ministers who wanted influence of their own. At times, Jesuits were expelled, only to find their way back through the trust of a new monarch or the loyalty of students educated in their schools. In Spain and Portugal, the conflicts ran deeper. Jesuits in South America had created reductions, communities where indigenous people lived under their guidance. These settlements were admired for their order and productivity, but royal officials feared they were too independent, too loyal to the Jesuit General rather than the crown. Accusations flew that the Jesuits were building their own empire within an empire. By the mid-18th century, these suspicions led to dramatic expulsions, with thousands of Jesuits marched out of colonies and forced to leave lands they had cultivated for generations. Yet even these acts of royal power did not fully erase their presence. Many Jesuits quietly remained in regions where rulers tolerated them, and their influence continued through the books they wrote and the students they had trained. The most decisive conflict came with the suppression of the order in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV, under heavy pressure from the Bourbon monarchs, officially dissolved the Society of Jesus. To the world, it looked like a final victory for kings over the Black Pope, But the story did not end there. Even during the years of suppression, Jesuits found ways to survive. In Russia, Catherine the Great refused to enforce the ban, allowing them to continue teaching and preserving their structure. In Prussia, they remained active under the protection of the state. And when the papacy restored the order in 1814, the Jesuits quickly returned to old strongholds, rebuilding schools and missions with remarkable speed. These cycles of expulsion and return reveal something striking about the order. They were never invincible, but they were adaptable. When a door was shut by a king, they found another through a queen, a minister, or even through the loyalty of the people. Their resilience only deepened the legend of the Black Pope, for how could a group suppressed by so many rulers always find its way back unless it possessed some hidden strength? The conflicts with monarchs showed the limits of their power, but the returns showed something more haunting, a persistence that made them seem less like an ordinary order and more like a shadow that could never be erased. One of the most remarkable qualities of the Jesuits has always been their memory. While kingdoms rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, and empires faded into dust, the Society of Jesus carried forward its knowledge with a discipline that rivaled any state. This was not the memory of individuals alone, but of an institution that valued archives, correspondence, and continuity above all else. Through letters, reports, and carefully stored documents, the Jesuits created what some scholars call the most detailed record of the early modern world. From the moment the order was founded in 1540, every Jesuit missionary and teacher was expected to write regular reports. These were not casual notes, but precise accounts describing everything from local politics to scientific observations. They arrived in Rome by ship, by caravan, and by messenger, forming a constant flow of information that was sorted, copied, and preserved. The Superior General relied on this river of ink to make decisions, but the real power lay in the fact that the information was never lost. Even when monarchs expelled the Jesuits, or when the papacy itself suppressed the order in 1773, the memory of the society endured. Archives were hidden, protected, or quietly transferred to safe places. When the Jesuits were restored in 1814, they reopened their records and carried on as though no interruption had occurred. Their memory bridged the gap of 40 years with an ease that startled outsiders. This continuity gave the Jesuits an advantage that few could match. A king might reign for decades, but when he died, his secrets often died with him. A government might keep records, but revolutions and wars frequently destroyed them. The Jesuits, by contrast, preserved their collective memory across centuries. They knew which strategies had succeeded in missions to Asia, which schools had thrived in Europe, which alliances had collapsed in South America. This gave them a quiet but powerful edge. They could return to a region after decades of absence and still remember the languages, the customs, and the mistakes of the past. Critics said this made them dangerous, an order that never truly forgot and therefore could never be defeated. To supporters, it was proof of their discipline and devotion, men committed not just to faith, but to learning and record-keeping. Today, historians still marvel at the scale of Jesuit archives. From astronomical observations in China to descriptions of native cultures in the Amazon, from detailed maps of unexplored regions to letters about the intrigues of European courts, the documents fill miles of shelving. They are a treasure trove for modern scholarship, but in earlier centuries they were something even greater. They were the living memory of an institution that outlasted kings and popes alike. This long memory became part of the legend of the Black Pope. For if knowledge is power, then an order that never forgot and could recall events with precision centuries later held a form of power greater than crowns or armies. It was the power to remember when everyone else had forgotten. From the beginning, the Jesuits promised absolute obedience to the Pope, but history reveals a more complicated dance between the white robes of St. Peter's successor and the black robes of the Superior General. Some popes welcomed the Jesuits as loyal defenders, while others regarded them with unease, aware that the order's discipline and reach gave it a strength unmatched by any other branch of the Church. This shifting balance of favour and fear became one of the engines that kept the Black Pope myth alive. In the 16th century, Pope Paul III gave official approval to the Society of Jesus, recognizing the genius of Ignatius of Loyola's vision. Later, popes leaned heavily on Jesuit scholars during the Counter-Reformation, sending them into Protestant lands as preachers and teachers. For these popes, the Jesuits were a weapon of faith, a force that could match the energy of their enemies with intelligence, persuasion, and devotion. Their success in schools and missions seemed to confirm papal wisdom in granting them such authority. Yet with each success came unease. Popes could not ignore that the Superior General commanded thousands of men who obeyed him with absolute loyalty. When letters from every continent flowed into the general's desk rather than directly into papal hands, some began to worry that knowledge and power were accumulating outside the Vatican's direct control. Popes such as Clement XIV felt the pressure of kings who demanded that the Jesuits be curbed. In 1773, Clement issued the decree suppressing the order, an act that broke the Society of Jesus on paper, but not in practice. To critics, this showed that the Black Pope had grown so influential that only the Pope himself could silence him, and even then the silence did not last. When Pope Pius VII restored the order in 1814, it was proof of another side of the dance. Popes could not live comfortably without the Jesuits for long. Their schools, missions, and intellectual energy were too valuable. Again, the pendulum swung back to favour. This pattern continued into modern times. Some popes relied heavily on Jesuit counsel, while others hesitated, worried that the order's independence might overshadow papal authority. Even Pope Francis, the first Jesuit to sit on the papal throne, reignited old questions. Did his background as a member of the order prove that the line between Pope and Black Pope had blurred at last? Or did it show that the myth was alive and well, still whispering in the background of Catholic power? The truth is that the Jesuits and the papacy have always been bound together in both trust and tension. The Pope is supreme, yet the Superior General commands loyalty that rivals it. This strange dance, with steps of closeness and steps of suspicion, ensures that the legend of the Black Pope never fades. For as long as popes both need and fear the Jesuits, the myth of a shadow ruler in black robes will continue to thrive. The Jesuits were not only known for their schools and missions, but for their inner discipline, a spirituality shaped by the teachings of Ignatius of Loyola. At the heart of this discipline were the spiritual exercises, a set of meditations and practices designed to sharpen the soul like a blade. These exercises involved silence, reflection, and a careful method of decision-making called discernment. For those inside the order, these practices were a way of aligning every choice with the will of God. For those outside, they seemed mysterious, even secretive, and it was in that misunderstanding that the aura of the Black Pope began to grow. The spiritual exercises demanded weeks of silence, where the Jesuit in training examined his conscience in detail. He would imagine scenes from the life of Christ, place himself inside them, and wrestle with the desires and fears of his own heart. This silence was not emptiness, but focus, a training in discipline that made Jesuits known for their clarity of thought and strength of will. Outsiders, however, often misread this quiet devotion as secrecy. If Jesuits seemed guarded or restrained, people assumed they were hiding something rather than practicing spiritual discipline. Discernment, another key practice, taught Jesuits to weigh choices not by impulse, but by deep reflection. Every decision was tested against inner peace, alignment with faith, and long-term purpose. This method gave the order an uncanny patience. While others rushed, Jesuits seemed to wait, observing until the right path revealed itself. To rulers and rivals, This patience looked strategic, even manipulative, as if Jesuits were always planning something hidden from view. Symbols added another layer of misunderstanding. The Jesuits adopted the letters IHS, the first three letters of Jesus' name in Greek, as their emblem. To them, it was a simple declaration of devotion, but enemies twisted it into strange interpretations, claiming it was a code for hidden messages or a mark of secret authority. The black robes they wore, a sign of humility and separation from worldly vanity, gave birth to the very nickname Black Pope. What was meant as simplicity appeared to others as shadow and power. Even their exercises in silence fueled suspicion. In a world where loud debate and public speeches marked politics, a group that valued quiet reflection seemed alien. People began to whisper that Jesuits had hidden rituals, that their silence was not prayer but plotting. The truth was far less dramatic, but no less powerful. Their spirituality created a discipline that made them formidable. They could endure hardship, adapt to foreign cultures, and stand firm under pressure because they had been trained inwardly first. Yet, in the eyes of the world, this discipline blurred into secrecy. Thus, the practices of Ignatius, born from a desire to purify the soul, unintentionally added bricks to the legend of the Black Pope. Silence became secrecy, symbols became codes, and discernment became manipulation. The misunderstanding endured, feeding a myth that has lasted for centuries, a myth where spirituality and power are always confused. When people think of hidden power, they often imagine dark rooms, locked archives, and whispers behind closed doors. Yet some of the most enduring influence of the Jesuits has always been in plain sight. Universities, parishes, schools, and even modern non-governmental organizations carry their name and spirit. To the casual observer, these institutions look ordinary, places of study, worship, or service. But when seen together, across countries and centuries, they form a lattice of connections that few organizations on earth can match. From the 16th century onward, Jesuit colleges became famous across Europe. Students trained in their classrooms included future kings, ministers, and writers. As the centuries passed, these schools multiplied, spreading to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Today, names like Georgetown, Fordham, and Sophia University are recognized worldwide, reminders that the Jesuit approach to education remains alive. Each institution stands on its own, yet all trace their heritage to the same founding vision. Linked together, they create not just scattered schools, but a global university system bound by shared principles. Beyond education, Jesuit parishes and retreat houses quietly serve communities in cities and villages. They may look like simple churches or centers for prayer, but they also function as nodes of connection, linking laypeople to the larger mission of the order. In times of crisis, these communities have often mobilized faster than governments, providing shelter, education, or relief. Their presence is unremarkable until one steps back and realizes how many dots appear on the map. In the 20th century, the Jesuits expanded into the world of social action, running charities, advocacy groups, and non-governmental organizations. These efforts fight poverty, defend human rights, and promote justice. On the surface, they resemble the work of countless other humanitarian groups, but their reach is amplified by the global Jesuit network. A program in Latin America can connect directly with scholars in Europe or activists in Asia, exchanging resources and strategies with speed that rivals any political alliance. Critics argue that this lattice of ordinary institutions hides a deeper unity, a network that can be directed like a single body by the Superior General in Rome. To them, a university is not just a university, but a training ground of influence. A parish is not just a parish, but a listening post in the life of a city. An NGO is not just charity, but a subtle arm of a larger design. Supporters dismiss such suspicions, pointing out that the work is public and the goals are openly stated. Yet the myth of the Black Pope thrives on the idea that what seems ordinary may in fact be extraordinary when seen as part of a larger whole. A single brick means little, but a wall of bricks forms a fortress. So too with Jesuit institutions. Scattered across the globe, they may appear isolated, but together they create a lattice of loyalty and influence that makes the Society of Jesus one of the most visible yet misunderstood networks in the world. Among the many traits that set the Jesuits apart, none is more striking than their vow of obedience. From the beginning, Ignatius of Loyola demanded not only discipline, but a willingness to obey, as if the voice of a superior were the voice of Christ himself. This level of submission shocked outsiders, who often saw it as blind or even dangerous. Yet, within the order, it was understood not as weakness, but as strength. Obedience became the foundation of unity, a strategy that allowed the Jesuits to move like a single body across continents and centuries. Imagine a missionary sent to China in the year 1580. He receives a letter from Rome, instructing him to change his approach with local officials. He obeys without delay, even if it means abandoning months of work. That act of submission may seem like loss, but in truth, it becomes a form of command, for it keeps him aligned with the larger mission and ensures that thousands of Jesuits can act together with one mind. This ability to function as a coordinated network gave the order a power that even monarchs envied. While kings struggled to control their nobles, the Superior General could direct his members with a precision that made the Society of Jesus feel like an army without swords. Critics called this dangerous, claiming that such obedience erased free will. They feared that Jesuits would follow any command, even against kings or nations, if it came from their general. Pamphlets painted them as puppets, controlled by a single hand, but Jesuits defended the vow as spiritual discipline, a training to set aside pride and ego in order to serve a higher cause. What made this obedience so unusual was its flexibility. It was not rigid in the sense of soldiers marching in step, but strategic, allowing Jesuits to adapt quickly to new situations while still following orders. A missionary in India might change his clothing to match local customs. A teacher in France might adjust his curriculum to meet political needs. Yet both would remain bound by the same vow. Obedience did not crush individuality, but channeled it into a larger purpose. This gave the Superior General a kind of command unmatched in the Church. He did not need armies or wealth. He needed only the loyalty of his men, who trusted that their submission was part of something greater. In practice, this created the impression that the general himself was a master strategist, when in fact his power rested on the obedience of thousands who believed they were serving God through him. Submission became command, and the world saw coordination that looked like conspiracy. The art of obedience made the Jesuits both admired and feared. To their supporters, it was proof of dedication and unity. To their enemies, it was proof that the Black Pope could move his followers like pieces on a chessboard. Either way, obedience turned into the very thing critics accused them of, a hidden strength that gave the order the appearance of an empire without borders and a general whose commands reached across the globe. Throughout history, the Church has faced moments of crisis that threatened to shake its very foundation. Wars of religion, political upheaval, intellectual revolutions, and scandals all tested its ability to survive. In many of these moments, one order seemed to appear again and again, stepping forward not only as defenders of faith, but as problem solvers, patching cracks that others could not. The Jesuits, with their discipline and global reach, gained a reputation as crisis managers of the faith, a role that strengthened both their prestige and the suspicion that they were indispensable to the Church's survival. In the 16th century, as Protestant reformers challenged Rome across Europe, Jesuits became the sharp edge of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. They debated with reformers, preached in hostile territories, and trained Catholic youth in schools designed to win back loyalty. Their skill at persuasion and their calm reasoning often restored confidence where bishops and priests had failed. To many, they seemed like the Church's emergency response team, deployed wherever the fire of heresy burned hottest. In later centuries, when the Enlightenment spread new philosophies that threatened traditional belief, Jesuits again stepped into the storm. They taught philosophy and science in ways that balanced reason with faith, offering the Church an intellectual defense at a time when many feared religion would be swept away by skepticism. Even when they were criticized for adapting too much, their ability to engage directly with new ideas gave the Church breathing space. During missionary crises, the Jesuits often stood at the front lines. In China, when debates raged about whether local customs could be reconciled with Christianity, Jesuit arguments for cultural respect delayed final condemnation and kept dialogue alive. In the Americas, when indigenous communities resisted colonial pressures, Jesuits sometimes acted as mediators, protecting people from harsher exploitation. These roles, though controversial, made the order appear not only loyal to Rome, but essential in moments of danger. Even in modern times, the pattern continued. In the 20th century, as the Church faced political revolutions and new social movements, Jesuits were often the ones engaging on the ground. They founded universities that became places of debate, and they advised popes during turbulent decades. Their presence in crises built an image of reliability. Whenever chaos struck, the Jesuits were already there, steady and prepared. Yet this reputation carried a darker undertone. If an order appears at every crisis, some begin to wonder if it thrives on crisis, or worse, if it quietly shapes events so it can appear as the savior. Enemies accused the Jesuits of manufacturing problems only to solve them, reinforcing the legend of the Black Pope as the hidden hand. Whether these accusations were true or not, perception was enough. The Society of Jesus came to be seen as the Church's secret weapon, the order that could not be spared, no matter how controversial it became. In every fire of faith they carried water, but in doing so, they also made themselves look like the ones who decided which flames burned and which were extinguished. The legend of the Black Pope did not remain locked in dusty pamphlets or whispered rumours. Over time, it slipped into novels, theatre, and eventually film, reshaped by popular imagination, until it became a modern myth. Fiction writers found in the Jesuits a perfect subject, a mix of secrecy, discipline, and influence that fit well into stories of intrigue. By the 19th century, the image of the Superior General had become a character in literature, sometimes portrayed as a sinister mastermind, other times as a shadowy guide with knowledge no one else possessed. These stories rarely cared about historical accuracy. What mattered was the aura, the sense that behind the visible Pope, dressed in white, there existed another figure, in black, pulling the strings of history. The rise of modern novels gave the myth even greater reach. In thrillers and dramas, the Jesuits appeared as conspirators, guarding forbidden secrets or manipulating world events. The Superior General was cast as the hidden power, sometimes more dangerous than any king. Even when authors admitted their tales were fiction, readers absorbed the mood. The idea of the Black Pope began to live not only in theology or history, but in the imagination of the public. When film arrived in the 20th century, the myth gained new life. Directors loved the contrast of light and shadow, the image of a figure in black robes moving in silence while the world turned around him. Movies and television shows borrowed freely from the legend, weaving Jesuit characters into plots about global conspiracies, ancient secrets, and struggles for control of the Church. These portrayals often exaggerated reality, but they fixed the archetype in popular culture. Even people with little knowledge of Catholic history came to believe that somewhere in Rome, a man in black robes directed unseen forces. The pattern continued into modern pop culture. From best-selling thrillers to documentaries, the Jesuits and their Superior General are often depicted as guardians of hidden archives, keepers of forbidden knowledge, or strategists behind world events. Each retelling adds layers to the myth, blurring the line between fact and fiction. The Black Pope becomes less a historical office and more a symbol of ultimate secrecy and influence. Critics of these portrayals argue that they feed paranoia and reduce complex history to simple drama. But in the world of entertainment, the Jesuits' true past matters less than the image they project. The media has acted as a mirror, reflecting public fears and fascinations back to the people, amplifying the aura of the Black Pope with every story told. Today, the myth thrives as much in pop culture as in religious debate. The figure of the Black Pope appears not only in history books, but in novels sold at airports and films streamed across the globe. Whether fact or fantasy, the image remains powerful. The world may not know the details of Jesuit spirituality or history, but it knows the shadow of a man in black, the whisper of power behind the throne, and that is enough to keep the myth alive in the modern age. Money has always been a subject that clings to power, and the Jesuits were no exception. From their earliest days, questions surrounded how this order of priests, bound by vows of poverty, managed to build schools, support missions, and maintain influence across continents. Supporters pointed to donations, benefactors, and the generosity of kings who admired their work. Critics whispered of hidden fortunes, estates, and secret financial streams that made the Superior General seem less like a religious leader and more like a banker in black robes. The truth was never simple, and it was in this murky middle ground that the myth of Jesuit wealth grew. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuit schools became some of the most respected in Europe. Wealthy families eager to see their sons educated often donated land, money, or endowments in gratitude. These gifts multiplied, and soon the Society of Jesus owned properties across nations. Each estate supported a school or mission, providing steady income for teaching and evangelization. On paper, the money belonged not to individual Jesuits, but to the order as a whole, managed for the common good. Yet, outsiders saw only the growing list of lands and buildings, and suspicion followed. In the colonies, Jesuit missions often thrived where others failed. In South America, their reductions were well organized and productive, trading goods that brought in revenue. Some monarchs accused them of running independent economies, hoarding wealth meant for the crown. Stories spread of hidden treasuries in the jungles of Paraguay, or silver flowing secretly into Jesuit hands. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories shaped public imagination, convincing many that the Jesuits were masters of finance as well as faith. By the 18th century, whispers of Jesuit wealth became a political weapon. When rulers in Portugal, France, and Spain sought to expel the order, they justified their actions by accusing the Jesuits of financial corruption. Estates were seized, accounts examined, and assets confiscated. Yet even after such blows, the order seemed to recover with surprising speed. This resilience only deepened suspicions. How could a group stripped of property return so quickly unless it had secret reserves hidden away? In modern times, Jesuit universities and organizations continue to receive donations from alumni, benefactors, and governments. These financial ties are public, yet rumors persist that the Superior General controls shadowy funds beyond the reach of oversight. Some conspiracy theories even claim that Jesuit wealth rivals that of the Vatican itself. Though no evidence supports such claims, the mystery of their survival fuels them. What is certain is that money has always shadowed mission. To educate, to travel, to build, resources were needed, and Jesuits proved skilled at managing them. Their ability to attract benefactors and to adapt financially gave the order both strength and suspicion. For their friends, it was proof of God's blessing. For their enemies, it was proof of hidden greed. In the legend of the Black Pope, finance becomes another layer of intrigue, a whisper that perhaps faith and money have been more closely entwined than the world has ever been allowed to see. Control does not always come through armies or treasure. Sometimes it arrives quietly through standards, reviews, and rules of thought that shape what people learn and how they understand the world. The Jesuits became masters of this softer form of authority by setting the boundaries of education, by guiding theological debate, and by reviewing ethical questions. They created what some have called an invisible index, a way of deciding which ideas were allowed to circulate and which would be quietly set aside. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church had a formal index of forbidden books, a list of writings that the faithful were forbidden to read. While this was an overt act of censorship, the Jesuits developed subtler tools. Their colleges, admired for discipline and rigor, established curriculums that shaped generations of students. The Ratio Studiorum, a document published in 1599, laid out detailed rules for teaching. Grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology were all ordered in precise steps. This plan was not just about learning, it was about guiding minds to think in ways that aligned with Catholic faith. Students trained in Jesuit schools carried these patterns with them into positions of power, influencing politics, literature, and science. Beyond classrooms, Jesuits also played a role in vetting theological ideas. As confessors, advisors, and scholars, they were often asked to weigh in on matters of doctrine. Their reviews carried weight, not because they had formal authority over the Church, but because their reputation for sharp reasoning made popes and bishops listen. This gave them a quiet gatekeeping role. A proposal that passed Jesuit review might spread widely. One that failed might disappear without ever being formally banned. In later centuries, Jesuit influence extended into ethics, especially as science advanced. When questions about medicine, economics, or political theory arose, Jesuit scholars often provided frameworks for judging what was acceptable. Their writings shaped debates on subjects as varied as slavery, just war, and human rights. By guiding these discussions, they did not need to forbid ideas outright. They only needed to set the terms under which ideas could be discussed. This invisible index was powerful because it was hidden in plain sight. Students accepted curriculums without question. Rulers sought advice without realizing they were also submitting to boundaries set by the order. Even in modern times, Jesuit institutions retain this role. Universities decide what texts to emphasize, what ethical codes to uphold, and what theological directions to encourage. These decisions may seem ordinary, but together they act as filters, shaping generations of leaders. Critics argue that this subtle control is more effective than open censorship. By guiding thought at the root, the Jesuits ensured that dangerous ideas rarely reached maturity. Supporters see it differently, calling it a service that protected faith while engaging with reason. Whichever interpretation one accepts, the outcome is clear. Through education, theology, and ethics, the Jesuits built an invisible index that steered minds without ever appearing to command them, proving once again that real power often works best when it does not announce itself. If one could step into the office of the Superior General and look over his desk in the 17th century, it would not be a crucifix or a crown that revealed his power, but a map. On parchment, stretched across the table, were lines of seas and coastlines, dots marking towns and missions, routes traced by couriers and ships. For the general, this was not only geography, it was strategy. Each mark represented a Jesuit presence, a community of men bound by obedience to him, extending his reach across the globe. Geography mattered because the Jesuits were never confined to Rome alone. Their strength lay in being everywhere at once. In Europe, they ran schools in France, Spain, and the German states, educating the next generation of rulers. In South America, their reductions dotted the landscape of Paraguay and Brazil, entire villages where faith and order mingled with local traditions. In Asia, their missions reached the courts of China, India, and Japan, while in North America, they built fragile outposts in forests and along rivers. Each location added a piece to the lattice of influence, forming a network so wide that few empires could compare. the map also revealed something deeper. By planting themselves at cultural crossroads, the Jesuits gained access to flows of knowledge and trade. A mission in Goa connected Europe to Asia. A school in Paris trained men who would govern colonies abroad. A community in Quebec stood at the gateway between Europe and the indigenous peoples of North America. The General's map was more than dots and lines. It was a web where each thread strengthened the others. This geography gave the Jesuits resilience. When they were expelled from one country, they often shifted their efforts to another. If France turned against them, Spain might still support them. If South America became hostile, Asia might open new doors. Like water, the order flowed into the cracks left by politics, always adapting, never disappearing. Enemies called this slipperiness proof of conspiracy. Friends called it proof of divine mission. For the superior general, it was simply strategy. Geography also meant information. From each mission came reports filled with detail about local rulers, customs, and resources. Over time, the general's map was not just a picture of places, but a living archive of the world's movements. Few kings or popes possessed such a wide view. This made the Jesuits indispensable, and at the same time deeply suspect. Even today, the Jesuit presence remains global, with schools, universities, and parishes scattered across continents. The Superior General still oversees men and works in dozens of countries. The modern map may no longer be drawn on parchment, but the principle remains the same. Geography is power. Where you are determines what you know, and what you know determines what you can influence. For centuries, the Black Pope's map has not been a decoration, but a reminder that to guide the world, you must first know where it stands. The Jesuits have always lived in a mirror, admired by some and despised by others. From their earliest years, the order attracted critics who accused them of ambition, manipulation, and secrecy. These enemies gave birth to pamphlets, rumours, and accusations that shaped public opinion. Yet, strangely enough, the opposition did not destroy the Society of Jesus. It helped define its identity, forcing the Jesuits to see themselves as a misunderstood vanguard, an order strong enough to endure hatred because they believed they served a higher mission. Breakaway voices often fueled these storms. Former members who left the order sometimes became its fiercest critics. Their insider accounts, whether true or exaggerated, painted pictures of hidden rituals, absolute obedience, and control that bordered on tyranny. Such stories were seized by rivals of the Church and spread across Europe, turning personal grievances into public scandal. Exiles added weight to suspicion. When entire nations or monarchs expelled the Jesuits, as happened in Portugal, France, and Spain in the 18th century, the world saw a pattern. How could one order be cast out by so many if there was not truth behind the charges? The image of Jesuits walking silently into exile, carrying few belongings but preserving their discipline, only deepened the legend. To friends it showed martyr-like endurance. To enemies it confirmed the idea of a dangerous power that even kings feared. These echoes of opposition carried into literature and politics. Enlightenment writers like Voltaire sharpened their pens against the order, accusing them of hypocrisy and domination. Politicians used anti-Jesuit sentiment to rally support for reforms. Even within the Church, some bishops resented their influence and spread warnings about their reach. Each attack became part of the public narrative, cementing the idea that the Jesuits were no ordinary order, but something larger, more formidable, perhaps even threatening. The Jesuits responded not only with defense, but with action. They doubled down on their schools, missions, and writings, using success as their answer to criticism. They also cultivated an image of humility and obedience, insisting that their loyalty to the Pope and to Christ outweighed any political agenda. This contrast between what they claimed and what their critics accused them of created a tension that kept the myth alive. To this day, echoes of those centuries-old criticisms remain. conspiracy theories about the Black Pope, fears of hidden influence, and suspicions of secret agendas all grow from the soil prepared by enemies long ago. Yet, the Jesuits themselves often wear these attacks as proof of their importance. In their eyes, being targeted shows that they matter, that their presence unsettles those who resist truth. Opposition, rather than erasing them, became a strange confirmation of their mission. In the end, the enemies, exiles, and echoes shaped both the order's self-image and the world's perception. The Jesuits became not only a religious community, but a legend, forged in the fire of criticism. And legends, whether loved or feared, rarely fade. The 20th century brought earthquakes to the Catholic Church, and none was greater than the Second Vatican Council held between 1962 and 1965. It was a moment when bishops and theologians from around the world gathered in Rome to rethink tradition, modernize practices, and open the windows of the Church to the changing world. For the Jesuits, this council marked a turning point. They had long been defenders of orthodoxy, sometimes accused of guarding secrets and suppressing dissent. After Vatican II, however, they began to speak more openly about social justice, human rights, and intellectual freedom. The shift was dramatic enough that even the myth of the Black Pope had to adjust to a new face. In the years following the council, Jesuit leaders encouraged their members to leave behind the image of an isolated intellectual elite and instead walk with the poor. Missions were redefined not only as preaching but as solidarity. Jesuits placed themselves in slums, refugee camps, and conflict zones. They became voices for liberation theology in Latin America, arguing that faith demanded action against oppression. To many young Catholics, this was a rebirth, proof that the Jesuits were listening to the cries of the world. But to their critics, it looked like politics disguised as religion. The old accusations of manipulation resurfaced, only this time framed around social movements instead of kings and empires. Alongside this focus on justice came a renewed commitment to intellectual freedom. Jesuit universities embraced dialogue with science, philosophy, and even non-belief. They encouraged critical thinking rather than rote memorization, a bold step in an age when the Church still struggled with modernity. Some hailed this as the natural fruit of Ignatius's vision, a faith unafraid of reason. Others worried it made the Jesuits too independent, too willing to push the boundaries of doctrine. The superior generals of this era walked a fine line. They declared loyalty to the Pope while also defending the right of their members to explore ideas that unsettled traditionalists. Once again, the tension between submission and leadership became visible, fueling the Black Pope legend with new material. The myth shifted from tales of hidden wealth or secret rituals to suspicions of ideological control, as if the Jesuits were masterminding cultural revolutions under a spiritual cloak. By the late 20th century, the Society of Jesus had become known as the Church's most progressive arm, champions of dialogue, education, and justice. The question then arose, could the old myth of the Black Pope survive in this new world? The answer seemed to be yes. The figure in black robes was still there, but now he was imagined not only as a manipulator of kings, but as a strategist of ideas. Whether standing with the poor in Central America or debating theology in European universities, the Jesuits carried an aura that suggested their influence remained unique. Reforms and reframing did not erase the legend. They reshaped it. In the modern era, the myth of the Black Pope adapted to new landscapes, proving that some shadows never disappear. They only change their form to match the light that falls on them. In March of the year 2013, the world witnessed a moment that many thought would never happen. A Jesuit was elected Pope. Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and introduced himself simply as Francis. The shock rippled through the church and beyond. For centuries, the Jesuits had taken a vow never to seek high office within the hierarchy. Their calling was service, education, and mission, not governance of the entire church. Yet now, one of their own sat on the chair of Peter, the most visible throne in Christendom. The event reframed the narrative of the Black Pope in ways that no conspiracy theory could have predicted. For those who had long whispered about Jesuit influence, the election of Francis felt like confirmation of every suspicion. If the Jesuit Superior General was once nicknamed the Black Pope because of supposed hidden power, what then could be said when the white robes of the papacy were actually worn by a member of the order? Did this mean the Black Pope and the real Pope had finally become one and the same? The myth seemed to fold in on itself, gaining new fuel in the process. Francis himself embodied traits of the Jesuit tradition. His emphasis on discernment, humility, and serving the poor echoed the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. He spoke with simplicity, often setting aside pomp and ceremony. He travelled lightly, lived modestly, and preached about justice and mercy. Yet behind his soft tone was a clear strategic vision, the kind that had always made Jesuits formidable. Critics said he was reshaping the church with the same quiet calculation that his order was famous for. Admirers saw him as a shepherd, finally bringing the spirit of Ignatius to the heart of the Vatican. The tremor was not only inside the church. Around the world, commentators pointed to the irony that the Jesuits, long suspected of pulling strings in the shadows, now led openly from the very centre of Catholic authority. The narrative of the Black Pope took on new dimensions. It was no longer about a secret general in Rome guiding events from behind a curtain. It was about whether the mindset of the Jesuits had become the mindset of the Church itself. Francis never spoke of himself as a Jesuit pope, but his background was impossible to ignore. His approach to governance, his attention to the margins of society, his willingness to challenge entrenched traditions, all carried the mark of his formation. Whether one loved him or feared him, it was clear that his election blurred the line between myth and reality. The day a Jesuit became pope was the day the story of the Black Pope entered a new chapter. What had once been rumour and speculation now stood visible in the light of St. Peter's Square. And yet, even in full view, the aura of mystery did not vanish. If anything, it deepened, for now the world wondered not if the Jesuits influenced the papacy, but what it meant when they were the papacy itself. In the 21st century, the Jesuits no longer rely on parchment letters carried by ships across oceans. Yet their way of operating feels strikingly familiar. The tools have changed, but the tactics remain the same. What once travelled by courier now moves instantly through digital networks. What was once a sealed report is now an encrypted message. Still, the rhythm is unchanged, quiet coordination across a vast map, always listening, always responding, always aligned with a larger mission. The world of global crises has only made this strategy more visible. When a natural disaster strikes in Asia or a refugee crisis erupts in Africa, Jesuit organizations often appear within days. Their schools, parishes, and NGOs provide both manpower and structure. Behind the scenes, the network pulses with communication. A Jesuit in Europe may transfer funds to a colleague in Latin America. Another in Rome may advise on media strategy. What looks like spontaneous action is in fact the old system at work, adapted to modern speed. The Superior General no longer waits months for a letter. Reports arrive in real time. Photos, statistics, and testimonies stream across his desk through screens rather than scrolls. Yet the essence of the method is identical to what Ignatius of Loyola set in motion in the 16th century. Information flows upward, decisions flow downward, and the order moves like one body. This ability to act quickly without losing cohesion gives the Jesuits a distinctive edge. Governments often stumble under bureaucracy. Corporations chase profit. The Jesuits operate with a blend of discipline and flexibility that makes them effective in crises. Their quiet coordination, so seamless that it feels invisible, fuels once again the old suspicion that the Black Pope commands more than prayer. Digital communication has also amplified their global reach. A homily delivered in Manila can be streamed in Rome. A lecture given in Boston can inspire students in Nairobi. The network that once relied on ships and riders is now instantaneous, allowing the order to shape conversations worldwide. Some critics argue that this makes the Jesuits too influential, that their ability to align thought and action across borders amounts to soft power on a scale no other religious order can match. Supporters counter that it is simply fidelity to mission, a continuation of what they have always done with the tools of the age. Ancient tactics in a modern world create a strange dual image. On the one hand, the Jesuits seem timeless, still practicing discernment, silence, and obedience. On the other hand, they appear utterly modern, fluent in digital platforms and global discourse. This mixture keeps the legend alive. The Black Pope is no longer imagined only as a figure with secret letters in a dark study. He is also imagined as a leader with access to a digital web, commanding coordination at the speed of light. Whether myth or reality, the perception endures. Modern instruments may change the sound, but the music remains the same. Quiet, steady, and always just beyond the edge of visibility, the strategy continues. At the heart of the Jesuit order lies a paradox. Ignatian spirituality, born from the vision of Ignatius of Loyola in the 16th century, calls for humility, discernment, and a deep personal relationship with God. It emphasizes listening to the stirrings of the heart, seeking freedom from selfish desires, and choosing paths that lead to greater service. On the surface, this seems to resist centralized power. It asks each member to hear God in his own conscience and to weigh choices carefully. Yet the very structure built on this spirituality became one of the most centralized and disciplined orders in history. How did a path meant to free the soul also create a system accused of building the legend of the Black Pope? Part of the answer lies in obedience. Ignatius believed that true freedom came from surrendering personal will to a higher mission. The vow of obedience was not about crushing individuality, but about removing pride that could divide the order. By yielding to superiors, Jesuits were meant to find greater unity with God's will. However, in practice, this meant that an immense amount of trust and authority flowed upward to the superior general. What was designed as spiritual alignment became in the eyes of outsiders a form of centralized control. Discernment added another layer. Jesuits are trained to reflect before acting, to weigh inner peace and long-term consequences before making choices. This method creates thoughtful individuals, but when guided collectively by one leader, it can resemble a system of calculated strategy. Each Jesuit listens to his heart, but the superior general listens to all of them, channeling their reflections into global direction. This gave the order a reputation for planning that looked less like prayer and more like power. Even the practice of the spiritual exercises plays into this paradox. Weeks of silence, meditations on the life of Christ, and examinations of conscience are meant to sharpen the soul. For Jesuits, it builds humility and focus. For outsiders, the discipline looks like training, almost military in its rigor, producing men capable of enduring hardship and following orders without hesitation. What was meant as spiritual exercise became interpreted as preparation for control. Does Ignatian spirituality resist power or enable it? Perhaps it does both. By teaching humility, it guards against pride, but by demanding obedience, it channels energy into a single command. By cultivating inner freedom, it resists worldly manipulation, but by aligning that freedom under one superior, it creates extraordinary cohesion. This duality is why the Jesuits have been seen both as saints and as schemers, as defenders of faith and as manipulators of kings. The theology of power in Ignatian spirituality may not have been intentional, but it is real. It gave the order a structure that magnified the role of the superior general. And in that magnification, the myth of the Black Pope found fertile ground. A spirituality meant to free the soul, ended up crafting an order that the world sees as both deeply spiritual and deeply powerful, a contradiction that has never been resolved. There is a story told in whispers of a chamber deep within Rome, a place known not by its grandeur but by its number. Room 33. It is not marked on tourist maps, and no guide leads pilgrims to its door. In truth, it may not exist at all, but as an allegory, it has lived for centuries in the minds of those who wonder how threads of Jesuit influence meet. Within this imagined room stand 4 pillars, each representing a way the Society of Jesus has touched the world. Education is the first. Books line the shelves, worn from centuries of handling, the titles ranging from Aristotle to modern physics. Here, young minds are shaped, not only in letters and logic, but in discipline and discernment. It is in these classrooms that future rulers and thinkers are formed, carrying with them the imprint of Jesuit instruction long after they leave the schoolyard. The second pillar is confession. In the corner of the room sits a wooden confessional, plain yet powerful. It reminds us that the act of spiritual guidance has long doubled as a channel of influence. Kings, queens, and ministers once bent their knees to Jesuit confessors, whispering sins and secrets alike. What was meant to heal the soul often flowed outward into the realm of politics, giving weight to the belief that the Black Pope held sway not through armies but through conscience. The third pillar is counsel. A desk stands at the centre, strewn with letters, maps, and reports. It symbolises the long tradition of Jesuit advisors, sitting beside monarchs and popes, offering words that carried more weight than commands. To counsel is not to order, but wise advice has often shaped the course of empires. Here in room 33, that counsel feels like a current flowing quietly beneath history's surface. The fourth pillar is command. Against the far wall stands the chair of the Superior General, simple in design yet immense in symbolism. From this seat, directives radiate outward to schools, missions, and communities scattered across the world. It is not the throne of a king, but the chair of a conductor, guiding an orchestra that stretches across continents. Command here is less about force than about harmony, aligning thousands of men through the art of obedience. Room 33 is not a place of bricks and mortar, but a metaphor for how these 4 forces converge. Education shapes minds, confession touches hearts, counsel guides rulers, and command coordinates action. Together, they create the aura of a hidden chamber where the society's influence gathers before spilling back into the world. The allegory endures because it captures something true, even if the room itself is only legend. Somewhere between classrooms, confessionals, courtrooms, and the general's office lies the intersection where power and spirituality meet. To imagine room 33 is to imagine the mystery of the Black Pope himself, a symbol of how many paths can lead to one centre, hidden yet present, ordinary yet extraordinary, silent yet echoing across history. Authority usually wears a crown, commands armies, or wins elections. It shows itself in banners raised over castles, parades of soldiers, or the signatures of lawmakers. Yet there exists another kind of authority, quieter and often more enduring, that does not need soldiers or ballots to survive. It is the authority of culture, the shaping of minds, the setting of norms, the slow weaving of influence into the very fabric of daily life. For centuries, the Jesuits have embodied this kind of power, one that historians call cultural hegemony. Consider what it means to run schools that educate not only peasants but princes. A boy raised in a Jesuit college does not merely learn Latin or mathematics. He absorbs values, discipline, and a worldview that will guide him when he becomes a minister or king. By the time he holds power, the crown may rest on his head, but the ideas shaping his decisions were planted long before. The authority is invisible yet real, power without a crown. This extends to art and science. Jesuits mapped the stars, studied languages, and contributed to mathematics. Their scholarship earned respect far beyond church walls. In sharing knowledge, they also shaped the questions others would ask and the frameworks within which answers were sought. Influence in science and philosophy is not enforced by decree. It spreads by credibility, by being the voice that others listen to when searching for truth. That too is authority, softer yet more lasting than military conquest. Confession added another layer. A general might command soldiers, but a Jesuit confessor could guide the conscience of a monarch. The battlefield decides who wins a war, but the confessional may decide whether the war begins at all. Here again is power without borders, authority exercised not over land but over the human heart. Even exile could not erase this influence. When kings expelled the Jesuits, their schools reopened elsewhere. Their books continued to circulate. Their ideas found new soil in distant lands. Unlike empires that collapse when armies are defeated, cultural power travels lightly. It survives because it lives in memory, in habits, in minds shaped long before. This is why the legend of the Black Pope endures. He does not rule a kingdom in the traditional sense. He commands no fleets or armies. Yet the order he leads has long been accused of steering the currents of thought, education, and belief. Whether these accusations exaggerate or not, the perception reveals how authority without a crown can appear even more formidable than authority with one. Cultural hegemony is difficult to measure, yet its effects are clear. It creates the rules of conversation, the limits of imagination, the sense of what is normal and what is unthinkable. That is the realm where Jesuits have often worked, quietly bending the arc of history, not through battle, but through influence. Power without a crown may seem softer, but it is also more enduring. Thrones crack, borders change, and armies fall. But the mind once shaped can carry a message across centuries. The story of the Black Pope lives somewhere between shadow and sunlight, never fully proven, yet never fully dismissed. On one side stand the myths, stories of secret rulers, hidden wealth, and plots stretching across centuries. On the other side lies the structure, a religious order bound by vows, directed by a superior general, and tasked with education, mission, and service. Between these two poles rests a grey space where truth and imagination blur, where the legend thrives because it is impossible to pin down. To separate myth from reality, we must first admit the reach of the Jesuits. They built one of the largest networks of schools and universities in the world. They travelled farther and adapted more skillfully than many other religious orders. Their leaders oversaw a global web long before modern technology made such coordination easy. These facts alone explain why they appeared so powerful. At the same time, accusations of world domination or secret control often reveal more about public fear than about Jesuit reality. The structure of the Society of Jesus is strict but transparent in its design. Each member answers to superiors, who in turn answer to the superior general. The general himself answers to the Pope. Decisions are made through reports, consultations, and discernment, not through mysterious rituals of hidden power. What appears like a dark conspiracy is often the product of discipline and communication. Yet the myth persists because discipline itself can look like secrecy. A man who obeys without hesitation, a school system that produces loyal elites, a confessor who whispers into the ear of a king, all create the impression of a shadowy network. It is not that the Jesuits invented these suspicions. It is that their effectiveness made them a natural target for them. Even the order's own survival through expulsion and suppression added to the aura. How could a group so often attacked still return with such strength? For some, the answer was faith and resilience. For others, it was proof of hidden hands at work. The grey space grows here, where fact and fear intertwine. Modern times have only deepened this paradox. Jesuits champion human rights, social justice, and education, often at the cost of political backlash. Yet critics see in these very causes another form of influence. shaping societies by framing the moral questions of the age. Reality shows priests teaching in classrooms, serving in refugee camps, and publishing scholarly works. Myth imagines them drafting secret strategies in hidden rooms. Both images exist side by side, neither entirely true nor entirely false. The Black Pope remains powerful as an idea precisely because he is impossible to define. He is a symbol of fear for some, of admiration for others, and of mystery for all. The challenge is to recognize the achievements and influence of the Jesuits without surrendering to caricature. The truth may not be as thrilling as legend, but it is no less important. 4. In the grey between myth and reality lies the story of how perception itself can shape power, sometimes more strongly than armies or crowns. Behind the curtain of rumour and legend, the Superior General is not a sorcerer cloaked in smoke, but a man of flesh and blood. He rises early, prays, studies reports, meets visitors, and signs letters. He carries the weight of a network that spans the world, yet he does so without a crown, without armies, and without borders to defend. His tools are words, ideas, and relationships. The title Black Pope makes him sound like a phantom, yet in truth he is a strategist navigating the complexities of a global church. The office demands discipline and foresight. Each decision ripples outward across continents. A change in the curriculum of a Jesuit university in Manila may shape leaders for decades. A word of support to a missionary in Africa may influence a village or even a government policy. The general rarely gives commands like a general on a battlefield. Instead, he guides, nudges, and harmonizes, ensuring that the Society of Jesus remains one body despite being scattered across nations and cultures. Critics imagine him as a ruler above the Pope, but the reality is subtler. His authority is strong but limited, powerful but always in tension with the broader church. What makes him unique is not domination, but the ability to orchestrate influence through patience and careful planning. To see the Superior General as merely a puppet master is to miss the humanity of the role. Each man who has carried the title wrestled with challenges, doubts, and personal limitations. Some were fiery visionaries, others were cautious administrators. All of them inherited both the respect and suspicion that the office attracts. The myth of the Black Pope may exaggerate their reach, but it does so because the idea of a single figure quietly shaping global thought is irresistible. And perhaps it touches something true, even if distorted. In an age where soft power matters more than brute force, the Superior General represents a form of leadership that feels both ancient and modern. He does not rule nations, but he educates those who will. He does not command armies, but he shapes consciences that decide whether armies march. He does not hold office, but he influences the questions that governments, universities, and parishes ask. In this way, his authority is woven into the invisible fabric of culture and belief. As the curtain closes, the Black Pope stands, revealed not as a dark overlord, but as a man whose power lies in subtlety. His strength is in strategy, patience, and the ability to move through history without leaving obvious fingerprints. And this raises the final question, one that echoes far beyond the walls of Rome. In a world where soft power guides more than weapons and ideas travel faster than armies, who truly rules? Is it the king with the crown, the president with the vote, or the man who shapes the way both of them think? Perhaps the answer is never clear. Perhaps the truest rulers are those we rarely see, those who work behind curtains, those who understand that silence itself can be the loudest voice.